Our next speaker is an alumnus of our esteemed university. Went on to San Francisco to join their master's program in ethnic studies and has been doing a research project on identity issues that face light-skinned people of color, and will be speaking to us on the theme of being middle of the margins, white passing, ethnic options, and the multiracial experience. This is Emily Renteria.
Ooh, it's fancy. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? This is like, wow, okay. So thank you for having me. Feels good to be back at my alma mater. I am originally from Modesto, went here for undergrad, as Dr. Tuedio said. My background and what brought me to this research is because I am a multiracial person myself. My father is Yaqui, which is the indigenous nation of northern Mexico, Sonora, and a little bit of French and a little bit of probably African ancestry in there, and white. My mom is Native American, black and white. So I've grown up sort of multiracial, multicultural, and actually I want to give a shout out to Natalie Vargas because she was my best friend in first grade, and she was the person who initially planted this question in me. As I was beginning to do my research, I was thinking back to, when was the first time I realized I was mixed? And it was with Natalie in first grade. So in the Central Valley, as many of you probably know, there are a lot of people like me who share similar backgrounds. There's a lot of third generation Mexican and Central Americans. There's a lot of people with one white parent or who have a lot of extended white family who themselves identify as Latino or Mexican American. And there's really not much discussion about how our experience differs from other Latinos, for one, from white folks for another, and from the larger mixed race movement as a whole, which predominantly, as of late in the literature, has been focusing mostly on black-white mixes, and lately Hapa, which is Asian and white mixes. So I kind of take as a ground for my research the notion that the United States was founded and built upon white supremacy, which has transformed its logic now into what I would call pigmentocracy, and other sociologists have as well, which is just the social hierarchy based on skin color and the perception of race. So I'm going to talk about my thesis research, which is in its final stages right now at San Francisco State University. I interviewed 13 people who self-identified as mixed Latinos. And I was looking for folks who were Latino with one white parent. And we did sort of informal over-the-phone interviews, mostly because they were spread out all over the United States, but also because I wanted their experience to speak for itself rather than me to make a judgment of them based upon how I think they look. And the reason for this is the first few interviews I did, we spoke a lot about Spanish aptitude. That was originally what my research was going to focus on, is how mixed people navigate being able to speak Spanish or not being able to speak Spanish, or having spotty Spanish use, and how they're received by people who identify as only Latino. What ended up happening was, after about 3 interviews, the conversations would invariably turn to this issue of appearance and passing. A lot of, I want to say 11 out of 13 people told me that they themselves passed as white, sometimes or almost always, and were kind of troubled by this. And so I guess that brought up some more questions for me, took my research in a different direction. Throughout the history since mixed race people have started being researched by sociologists mostly, we're talking about past the eugenics movement, I hope, they've been described in sort of pejorative terms. Like marginal men is one, tragic mulattoes is another trope that some people might be familiar with. And the idea is that people of mixed ancestry are doomed to be cultural outsiders, no matter what. I was unsatisfied with this identification of us, because I know that there are a lot of mixed race people out there, but especially in the Central Valley, because it's so commonplace to be white and Latino, they might not be out, or they might not think of themselves as mixed race, because that's often something relegated to different combinations. So I'm going to begin with a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's from this book, from Ta-Nehisi Coates, sorry. This is Between the World and Me. I think this is a wonderful book. You can read it in a couple hours, and I highly recommend everybody go out and read it right now. It's about the state of race in America. And I think that this quote applies to multiracial people in particular because of that sense of being between two worlds. So he says, "What I know is that there's the burden of living among dreamers, and there is the extra burden of your country telling you the dream is just, noble, and real, and you're crazy for seeing the corruption and smelling the sulfur. For their innocence, they nullify your anger, your fear, until you're coming and going, and you find yourself inveighing against yourself." So a lot of my interview participants spoke to this feeling of being outside and knowing that something wasn't quite right, not only with the racial classification system as it exists in the United States, but also with the fact that they were receiving advantages, benefits, and privileges associated with their white passing appearance that many people in their family, for example, did not experience. And let's see. So this population of people, like I said, is pretty large in the Central Valley. The overall mixed race population in the United States has grown by approximately 30%, according to the census between 2000 and 2010. And if you combine Latinos, which are already kind of by definition a multiracial community, then that jumps another 18% to have a total population of 18% in the United States being mixed race. So data from my interviews aligns with the existing literature that multiracial people do feel themselves positioned between two worlds. And I'm gonna quote kind of heavily from my interviews because I want those folks to have their voices heard a little bit. So one participant told me, "It's definitely difficult, not fully belonging. I can't really identify as one thing or another. It's like I'm not really one thing ever fully. I think I definitely navigate several worlds more easily because of that. Like, I have the advantage that my dad was white and spoke English fluently, and I had all the advantages that come with being a white male in our society, so I definitely learned how to properly behave in a society with standards like that," end quote. So what this person is talking about is being able to pass socially, and passing, I'll define very loosely. It's usually understood as an abbreviation for racial passing, which describes the fact of being accepted, of representing oneself successfully as a member of a different group. Generally speaking, passing refers to the means by which non-white people represent themselves as white. This is a little kind of like a tenuous connection, I feel, because these people are half white, but they're also, partly have ancestries of color. Nearly all of these participants experienced what Jessica Vasquez calls flexible ethnicity, which is the ability to be considered an insider in different racial and ethnic communities. This context-dependent passing due to ethnic ambiguity was evident in almost every person of 13 that I interviewed. And some of them also, going sort of the opposite direction, utilized an inversion of passing, in which they self-defined as white but passed as a person of color in order to receive social, economic, and educational opportunities. This has also been called Rachel Dolezal syndrome by friends in the ethnic studies department. One interviewee participant told me that if we're talking about this spectrum, this swath of Latino identity, there's a lot I've never experienced or had to experience, and there's a lot that I have, and a lot of that comes with being white. Being able to pass visually in both worlds, I'm sure, has done wonders for me. So my work seeks to explore how people use both forms of passing, both on the white side and on the Latino or person of color identity, and what this means for the changing state of race relations in the US. I believe that the Loving versus Virginia decision is kind of a place to start to give good context. This is a decision took place in 1967 that legalized miscegenation between interracial marriage, basically. It was illegal before that. And a lot of mixed race activists and advocates believe that this means that the nation is becoming more progressive, ostensibly so, but they also the subtext is that race mixing will eliminate racism altogether, that one day, 2048 or 2050, whatever it is, when people of color are gonna be in the majority, that there's this notion that if we're all sort of beige, then discrimination will go away. I argue that that's not true. Another quote from a woman named or I'm sorry, I'm not going to give her name. She says, white supremacy sees the color of your skin. The police do too. Capitalism sees your ability to assimilate, to talk right, to wear professional clothes, to fit into a big business-made box. We encourage not to mention the languages we speak, struggle to speak, reclaim, or forget. She goes on to say that whiteness, for white-passing mixed-race people, and for white people too, is not a race. It is an institution designed to keep power in the hands of the white minority to the detriment of everyone else. Like all borders, whiteness is porous. Light-skinned people are assimilated into whiteness when it is convenient for whiteness to pacify it rather than attack. And we've seen this throughout history before the Loving versus Virginia decision, where multiracial people were, totally shunned, ostracized, looked at as sterile, experimented upon, and generally seen to represent some sort of moral failure on the part of their parents. My work utilizes Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Latin Americanization thesis, in which he talks about an emerging triracial system in the United States, different than the black-white divide of probably our parents' generations, where he talks about 3 tiers, and I'll go into those in a moment, what they entail. But he says that multiracials will belong to a buffer class of, quote, honorary whites, invented by white elites in order to de-escalate racial tension. These people can be identified as the ones claiming, but we're all Americans, and insisting that race mixing proves the nation is making progress in the struggle for racial equality. So Bonilla Silva's triracial system is basically whites at the top. This includes white immigrants from, presumably Western European countries. The honorary whites, to which the multiracial class belongs, which are Eastern European immigrants, light-skinned multiracials, some Asians, which he qualifies by their income and the neighborhoods in which they live. And what he calls the 3rd tier, the bottom tier, is the collective black, which is basically anyone with dark skin, anyone who's a recent immigrant who looks like the stereotypic idea that we have of, like, for example, Mexicans, Latinos. His research is primarily upon Latinos and the differences in life chances based on skin color. So my interviews are definitely consistent with his idea that multiracials do fit into this honorary white class in that they experience privileges, particularly in terms of educational and financial opportunities because of their passable appearance that are not available to darker skinned multiracials or monoracial Latinos, sometimes within their own families. So the Latin Americanization of race relations simply refers to a non-binary racial system. But like I said, the addition of nuance via pigmentocratic logics does little to destabilize the white supremacy upon which the nation operates. So Bonilla Silva predicts that people with this honorary white status will still remain secondary, will still face discrimination, and will not receive equal treatment in society. Further, he predicts that this group will adopt white-like racial attitudes and distance themselves from members of the, quote, collective black, unquote, the lowest tier of his system. I'm interested in what he means by the white-like racial attitudes in particular. So I looked to Mary Waters, who wrote a book called Ethnic Options back in 1990, where she interviewed like hundreds of white Americans, middle class, who had roots, whose ancestors immigrated from Western Europe, basically. She found that ethnicity was a type of like fun choice for Anglo-Americans because they don't belong to a racialized group. They mostly experience their ethnicity as an option, making it difficult for them to understand why non-white groups could not, quote, get over it, the past, end quote. She coined the term symbolic ethnicity, which gives these middle-class Americans she interviewed a sense of rich culture through a community with no cost to other contradictory values we also crave, such as individuality, flexibility, and openness to new ideas. She also says that the ways in which ethnicity is symbolic and flexible for middle-class white Americans are the very ways in which it is not so for non-white and Hispanic Americans. One of my interview participants spoke to this dynamic, I thought, in an interesting way. Again, I don't know what she looks like. She says that she passes as white sometimes, but she very strongly identifies as a person of color. She had an experience where there was a person of color only space, and she attempted to speak in that space and was told to sort of hold off and wait to the end by a darker-skinned woman of color. She insisted that her light skin does not change the fact that she's a person of color. For me, I kind of bristled a little bit when she said that, because of the history of the term person of color, for example, comes out of the Black feminist movement in the 70s. And if she's being read by this large of a group of people as a white person, then can she really claim that identity as a person of color, which carries with it all this history and sort of baggage and politicization around what it means to have dark skin in the United States. So I guess my question is sort of, where is this person of color identity located for someone who insists that even though she's white passing, she's still brown? She appealed to her ancestry. Her mom is from El Salvador, so she's been raised to some extent in that culture. Overwhelmingly, though, she fit the profile of many of the people who participated in my interviews who passed as white, which was that they were middle class, upwardly mobile, and either had degrees or were in process of obtaining degrees, so they're quite educated. A lot of people took issue with these sorts of tests of authenticity that this woman was sort of speaking to, where in order for her to sort of prove herself to this group of folks of color, she feels the need to, well, my mom this, or well, I ate this growing up, or well, I grew up poor too, or this sort of very stereotypical idea of what it means to be a person of color. And on both sides, people tend to rely on these sort of essentialist ideas of person of colorhood, if I could say that. And I was more troubled by her assertion because the assumption of access to space is also something that is very white, in my opinion. The assumption that I can walk into anywhere and have a right to speak, and that I should be granted the right to speak, and that if anyone challenges me, I can step up to them because I have a right to be here, was something that has been identified time and time again in whiteness studies and also amongst my interview participants as being a white thing. So I guess the fact that these people I interviewed are sort of taking up white racial attitudes as predicted by Bonilla Silva's work serves to not only verify his work, but also adds a little bit of complexity to this multiracial identity that I study, because some of the key figures in the research about multiracials, or the key pieces of what the multiracial movement says it's about, is the right to self-identify, that no one else can tell you who you are, that you should be able to identify however you want, differently on different days, differently to different people, and that's your right as a mixed race person. And while at first blush, there's nothing wrong with self-identifying, I think, this instance in the person of color space did bring up some troubling, I guess, questions for me. So Maria Root is a really famous multiracial scholar, and some people credit her with sort of starting the mixed race movement in the early 90s. So she's the person who says that you have the right to self-identify no matter what. But she also wants to make multiracials responsible for calling out racial inequity and injustice wherever they go, which to me was a little bit of a contradiction, because if you can self-identify, then can't you disidentify with your need to be a part of this racial justice issue? While I do think that that's something that everyone should take up, I just have, I guess, some trouble with this assertion that identities can sort of be picked, like you're in a grocery store. Like, it's very capitalist, it's very this marketplace type of mentality that I can be whoever I want, and it has zero impact on presumably myself or the people around me who experience that same identity in maybe more nuanced or more disadvantaged ways. So doing so, this sort of passing exposes just how high the stakes can get when identities are the keys that open doors of opportunities. Passing is about a manifestation of value. Passing is what happens when you learn that you discover and you're valued as members of some communities and not valued as a member of other communities. So this is a very complex expression of social worth within a hierarchy, and the hierarchy being race. So just one last quote, I'll end. Handling your privilege means turning a critical eye to the way that you think while still treating yourself like a valued, loved friend. And this is from a blog called Light Skin Tears that I like to read. Finally, in closing, I'm really concerned about what all of this talk about self-identity and that being the most important thing for mixed race people means for the Black Lives Matter movement and for the state that we're in with the ridiculous amount of police violence and deaths of Black men at the hands of the police in this country, and the just ridiculous amounts of incarceration, and the ways that things are so disproportionate that the identities do mean something, I believe, because the type of identity that gets you like killed for walking down the street with a bag of Skittles in your hand is not the same as, you know, someone sort of arbitrarily in a school space or a political organizing setting claiming that they're something. Like basically it has no impact for a mixed race person who passes as white to say that they're a person of color, where for some people of color, it does make a huge difference. It's like a life and death difference. So if the appropriate categorization and individualist free market identity thinking are the most salient concerns for multiracial people charged with the task of becoming anti-racist activists by Maria Root's seminal work, then they're edging dangerously close to proving Bonilla Silva's thesis correct, that honorary whites will develop white-like racial attitudes, except that this group does not appear to be distancing themselves from the lowest rung of Bonilla Silva's rubric, the collective Black. They're doing quite the opposite. So I guess my question is, what are they doing? Are they appropriating? Are they exoticizing? Are they fetishizing? Do they not realize what's at stake in their choice to self-identify as folks of color when darker-skinned folks of color are you know, being killed by cops all the time? So this is something that I'm still definitely in process of and would love to hear your questions and responses, comments as I move into the final phases of my thesis. So thank you. We have time for a question.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Have you seen the work of Nancy Leong? Oh, okay. I just suggest you check it out. I was just actually curious to get your take on it. So she argues, she's a law professor, she has two articles. One is called Racial Capital, or Racial Capitalism. And the other one is called Ethnic Entrepreneurship. So it just your work reminded me of hers, but I think you're taking a different take than she does. But she basically argues that in the context of racial capitalism, some people of color are able to take advantage of their identities in certain situations. So I was wondering what you think of that argument that at some points identities can be deployed in ways that people find useful for themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely think that that's true. Overwhelmingly, almost all of my participants reflected that as well. I know in my life that's what brought me to this research, is the ability to fit in different places and to use that to my advantage. I think that's also one function of the coming pigmentocracy that Bonilla Silva talks about, that it's less about race anymore as defined by these rigid categories and what you check on a form, more so about how you look, how light your skin is, what texture your hair is, and so on like that.
So typically when we look at kind of the theory of colorism, the lighter you are, the more advantages you get in jobs, you can date, etc. But there is something like a working hypothesis about a paradox of colorism. So the only time it's bad when you have light skin that you could be identified as a person of color is authenticity into that identity, and kind of people are working through what that kind of rejection of being an authentic person of color might be. And I don't want to return to the tragic mulatto, but in terms of self-esteem and mental health, there are a lot of working issues there. And I'm just curious what your research participants talked about in terms of how they saw themselves or any kind of problems with that identity because of the disjoint between how they want to identify and how other people are saying yes or no.
Right. I think there was kind of like a bell curve happening. So some people were like, oh, well, if they say no, I'm just going to fall back. And some people were, no, this is who I am. And then there was a lot of people in between who would identify as people of color when it was safe to do so, when they felt safe to do so socially. And a lot of them, I mean, they're mostly in their early to mid 20s and in colleges and political organizing and stuff like that. So they're bumping up against these problems in ways that maybe a lot of us don't in our not college lives or not political lives. And yeah, they definitely, they knew that they walked through the world for the most part as white people, that they were not followed in stores, they were not discriminated against, they were not assumed to, be children of migrants or to be migrants themselves or anything like that. They experienced almost zero discrimination. But the reason that I say they're adopting these sort of white-like racial attitudes is because they do take on that person of color identity when it benefits them to do so. So college admissions forms, or if there's like a cool party that's mostly, people of color, they want to go, and there's been a whole rise in these social functions where it's like people of color only spaces on college campuses. And they want to participate because a lot of their friends are. And so, yeah, then at that point they would, self-identify as a person of color, go to the party, might get mad side-eye at the party, but, they're still there. No one's turning them away because the authenticity, they can point to their ancestry or they can point to, this, that, or the other. And I guess at a certain point, no one's going to fight them on that, or maybe they just hadn't encountered someone who was going to push back hard enough to get them not to go to these different spaces. But there were a handful of people too who said, like, I know that at this particular student group, I'm too light-skinned to be considered a participant, so I'm just not going to go, and like respect that. And I think if talking about the ally identity and things like that, if you're trying to be a real ally, then you kind of have to listen to what the group that you're allying with is saying, and fall back if they want you to. You and then.
We talked a little bit earlier, but did any of your participants talk about their parents and the way they grew up? Because with me, I come from a biracial family, multiracial family. But if you look at me, you see a black woman. But me being also married to a white man, our kids two of my children are lighter than you are. And one of my sons, as I mentioned, got his job as a firefighter. The only firefighter for 5 counties over that's African American because they thought he was Hispanic, a light-colored Hispanic. Now, the other 2 of our daughters are my complexion, and my oldest daughter, again, is lighter than you, and most people take her for being Hispanic. And so, in our household, while our children were growing up, I never denied them who they were. I never made them choose. I would always make them proud of who they were, both their father's side and my side of the family. And so when your participants talked about choosing or having to go black or white or the darker complexion, did they ever talk about the way that their household was, how it was coming up as biracial kids in the household?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of them felt the same ways it sounds like you've raised your kids, that both their parents were totally open about who they were, never made them choose. And the ones with siblings were particularly interesting because they, sometimes a sibling would be much lighter or much darker than them. And so I guess none of their parents ever, it sounds like, put them in any sort of uncomfortable situation with regard to race. But as far as family life and upbringing, there's definitely this class element that kept coming up where they were upper middle class and, both parents very educated. And it's not really within the scope of my research to say how that might impact them, but I speculate that it does. Because the higher you go up on the class spectrum as well, like the more privileges you have and the more freedom you have to identify as you want, I think, but just walking down the street out in the world that, their parents never really had to address this issue of colorism or being mixed with them because they're, by and large, not experiencing discrimination. They're not having to have those moments of like, Mom, why did this kid call me this at school today or something? It's not happening,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And having explained our kids, we had 2 once. Being in Sonora, some cowboy shouted out the window, holy shit, would you look at that, someone get a noose. When they saw me and my white husband with our black children and our biracial kids.
So we did have to explain why these two guys said something like that. But again, you know, my kids grew up knowing they were part black, they were part white, and to be proud of who they are, and they never had to choose. They were just who they were. So yes.
Cool. Thank you.
No, interesting, my question kind of follows along yours too, because I had a different experience though, because my father is Hispanic, my mother was Anglo, but my father didn't accept his nationality, so I grew up feeling a lot of guilt related to him. And I'm wondering if you ran into people feelings of guilt, because I mean, there's so many different reasons that you could feel it, but I felt it because he wasn't accepting.
Yes, there were one, maybe two participants I spoke with who really wanted to distance themselves from their Latino ancestry. One of them was raised almost exclusively by her white mother in a very wealthy Bay Area suburb, and felt that most of her white peers were discriminating against her for being part, she would say Hispanic, I don't like that word, but you know, she felt like she was being discriminated against, but also because of her mom being a single parent, they were a little bit lower on the class status, you know, ladder than a lot of people she went to school with. And so she wasn't really able to parse out how much of that was because of her background and how much of that was because of money. And there was another person who spoke about, you know, her white mother's family having gone to UC Berkeley for generations, and her Salvadorian father just being lucky to have gotten into Stanford. He's a doctor now, but I speculate that getting to medical school is not a feat of luck. And so yeah, in terms of the guilt factor, I definitely think that is there, like, on both sides. Overwhelmingly, my participants felt guilty for their white side and for the racism that they would bump up against with their white family members, and the, you know, sort of having access to both of those viewpoints by virtue of being multiracial was an issue. Yes?
I wanted to ask you mentioned the book. I just wanted to get the name of what that book was being talked
Is it
about.
Between the World and Me?
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.